No.
Well, I am delighted to be back with a phenomenal panel. We may have swerved a little bit in our direction on the summit of the clash of generations, but we are firmly back on track here. And I just want to remind you what we're talking about here. Everywhere that you turn these days, the world does seem to be out of joint. And in part, that is because the young and the old are pulling us in different directions. All those differences are playing through to all kinds of different global challenges, competing needs and competing priorities. Let's get down into the trenches with 5 people in fact, who are doing the hard work. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and I'm going to ask them to share a very pithy story of how in their own work they bridged the generational divide, or were helped to bridge it. So first, I want to start with Akash Shah. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Excited to be back.
Good. Well, you're very welcome here. Chief Growth Officer at BNY Mellon, youngest member of a large bank's executive committee, direct CEO report. You were one of the youngest ever partners at McKinsey. I don't know if you still, though, consider yourself a young leader, do you?
Certainly the gray hair doesn't suggest it, but that's...
So tell me how you have bridged the generational divide or were helped to bridge it.
Well, I think I'm expected to put out some labels. So I'm an elder millennial, I think is the definition. And a lot of people will call us the transitional generation as well, bounded between Gen X and Gen Z. The way I think about it is that when I was in high school and college, we had already gone through periods of enormous reversals of trends we thought were going to happen for a long time. At that time, it was globalization and that the world was infinitely moving in one direction. And then we've lived through financial crises, a global pandemic. When you put it all together, these were all so-called, 6 standard deviation events, and they all happened in a really short period of time for 20 years. And I think the biggest thing that we have to do as a generation of leaders is think about how we deal with uncertainty and risk. And how do we do that when the world has told us there is actually more uncertainty and risk than we ever thought there was? And as leaders, especially ones who have the responsibilities that this illustrious group has, we have to not only stay steady ourselves and show resilience, but we have to build resilient organizations. And I think one of the major themes for us is how do we ensure that folks are aware of risk, are exposed to it, but at the same time do not shy away from it. And it could be small things, new experiences, and it can be big things like starting a new venture, doing the next big thing. So that's very much on my mind these days.
Interesting. Anything that you can share about something that when you personally had to bridge that divide?
Yeah, the thing that's very much on my mind, especially when we're here together physically once again, is so much of my best professional experiences was taking that assignment in a new market, a new country that I didn't know very well. And the first time I actually came to the kingdom was when I was 22, a young consultant. It was a place I had very little exposure to beyond pop culture. And now, 15 years later, some of my closest friends and professional contacts are from those experiences going from New York to Riyadh at that time. And I think about how much richer my life is for it. And I just think that we as leaders have to continue to encourage our colleagues to take that extra step, get out of their comfort zone, and also risk even at the peril of other things these days.
Interesting. So you'll notice on this panel, we've got a variety of experience. So from financial services now to agri-tech, in fact. So let me introduce you to Farah Emara. She's the co-founder and CEO of FreshSource Global. So tell me, Farah, how did you bridge the generational divide? I think you're actually doing it almost every day in your company. Is that right?
Yes, so we actually have a very interesting story. Just to give a background, FreshSource is the MENA region's first business-to-business agri-supply chain platform. So we partner with a range of producers and sell directly to businesses such as hotels, restaurants, etc. In our team, it's myself and my brother. We're the 2 co-founders, and we have a team of around 85 people. across 4 generations. So we manage all the way from 20s until 60s. So we have a lot of different diversity amongst the team. The really interesting story, I think, when it comes to the clash of generations and priorities is how FreshSource actually came to life. So it's our family business is in agriculture. It started in the 80s, and it was a very traditional way of doing business, agriculture and trading in general. And with FreshSource, we're thinking, Omar and I, when we were thinking of when to start it and how to start it, it was really built on how can we take what the family business has built and what that generation has achieved and really accelerate and catalyze that growth through the use of data and technology. So.
Interesting. So speaking of data and technology, that's a perfect segue to Will. Ahmed, did you pay her for that? That was very good. So Will is the founder and CEO of Whoop, and if you don't know what Whoop is incredibly technological piece of wearable device. You'll tell us more about it, but tell us about how you are bridging the generational divide.
Well, interestingly, we have a pretty wide-ranging population on Whoop. I'll give a quick background on the technology. So we build these little wearables that measure everything about sleep and recovery and exercise. There's a huge focus on 24/7 health monitoring. And what we've noticed from a generational standpoint is different ways to engage with the data and ultimately share this data. So just generalizing for a second, older generations tend to be looking at their data in a much more one-to-one way. You know, they're building a personal relationship with the app and many of the features in the app, the coaching, the health monitoring, and they're focused primarily on understanding their own data. What we see from teenagers on Whoop, folks in their younger 20s, is that they're also engaging much more with the social features. So we've got the ability to stream videos, for example, with all sorts of different Whoop data on top of it, your heart rate in real time, your strain. We also have a whole teams and community feature, so it allows you to essentially share data with friends, family members, even a huge audience. And I think overall we see more of a willingness to make data public from the younger generation. And we as a company believe that ultimately the end user should own the data, which is a policy that I think is quite different than many large technology companies in the space, which are arguably more focused on monetizing your data. We really think you ultimately should own that data. And so it'll be interesting to see how over time different generations on Whoop push their data.
Fascinating. And you started the company quite young, straight out of university, is that right?
Yes, I started the company when I was 22 at Harvard, yeah.
And did you have an issue with generational divide there? Were you questioned as a young co-founder or not?
Well, I think there's a certain insecurity that comes with building a business at that young of an age. I think I spent probably 2 years at Harvard doing research, just convincing myself that I was able to start a company. So a lot of it, frankly, for me at that young of an age was overcoming the doubt associated with building a business. I think it's nice over time having more and more folks in the room who are younger than me and older than me. Certainly when you're 22 starting a company, you find that you're the youngest person in the room all the time.
Right.
And so you have to overcome some of that.
So Guillaume Lacroix, he's the CEO of Brut. It's a media company, and if you haven't heard of it, you soon will, because they have 2 billion folks who are watching their videos across social media. We were trying to figure out exactly what percentage of the world was, but in fact, it pretty much means all of the youth are watching them. Tell us a little bit about a story from your work at Brut and how you've seen or you've been influenced by that generational divide.
So my partners and myself, we come from the TV world, the news world. My partner is 64, I'm in my 40s, and on average, a Brut team member is 26 years old. I think one of the first month in, we work in a very traditional way. We have a news conference in the morning, and one of our young women journalists came to us saying, I want to do something, I want to do a report on man spreading.
Pleased to see that nobody on the panel is manspreading
Exactly.
at the moment.
And so probably because I'm a male, probably because I'm over 40, probably because I'm not taking public transportation, I had no idea of what was manspreading was. And in my head, I was like, yeah, good luck with that report. It's going to tank. There's no way people are going to relate to that. And to that date, 6 years ago, it's probably one of the most successful videos we had ever. It started a debate in French society, and we even made a series out of it. So I think it's a very good example of when it comes to my industry and the media, the news cycle can be very different. And in order to have a relevant news cycle for Gen Z, you need to make sure that Gen Z are actually creating the news cycle. And it's been very powerful. And it's probably one of the reasons why we'll be so successful, I guess.
You've got a lot of data on youth, and I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I want to bring in Máximo Mazzocco here. He's the founder of Eco House Global, an activist, among other things. Tell us about your experience, though, with the generational divide. How have you been helped to bridge it, or how have you helped someone else to do that?
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much for inviting us. I've been working since the last 15 years of my life, well, my whole adult youth life with youth. And the thing for us is to understand why we are doing this. And when we talk with my companions, with my colleagues, to understand that. In our case, that we are climate and ecological entrepreneurs and activists, we have all the time data like 1 million species are threatened to disappear. That kind of data moves us. And if we don't understand that, we don't have that empathy, we don't listen, we do not communicate, we do not inform as leaders of our companies or movements or foundations, there we will have a problem always with new generations, because we are in the era of too much information, but with social media, open, blockchain, we are going there. So for us, it's very important to, when we engage, to make them understand that if we don't know how to do something, let's say it, not like lie. The Richard Quest panel was amazing during the morning, because all the time he stopped and said, okay, but how? Very nice words, but how? How we are going to do this? We need to be humble sometimes. Okay, we exactly don't know how to do the energy transition. We exactly don't know the plan for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years as a government. But we have these ideas. Let's build these ideas together. The best conversations I have during my whole COPs, Conference of Parts of Climate Change, were with leaders when they sit down and say this in a humble way.
That's interesting. So you do sit down with leaders at the climate summits, and they ask for your opinion.
Yeah, all the time. Not only mine. We are thousands and thousands of youth that we are trying to engage, because we want a better world, as simple as that. And as I was saying, for me, moving forward is when I sit down with a leader and he is humble. He looks to me and say, we are trying. And if they are greenwashing, they say to me, now I can only do this.
Right.
But if not, try not to greenwashing. That's a so important thing right now to engage youth.
Okay, so I'd love to hear from Guillaume the data that you've gathered and what you see resonates with your audience. What have you learned? What have you learned about the generations who are watching your videos, your news?
I guess the first thing we've learned during those 6 years is really that they hate to be told what to think. That's really, and it's across the globe. And when you think this way, the other thing that comes to play, at least in media and information, is if you are over 40 years old today, you've been raised in a world where you had a curated access to information. You had probably like 2 big free TV network, two daily newspaper, 1 or 2 radio station. So it means that those generations have a common grammar of the world when it comes to make it more relatable. Okay? When you're 16 years old or 18 years old today, you grew up in a world where you had your phone, you had information or media pushed by algorithm, very different from your best friend, very different from your sister, your parents and everything, if your parents were using social media. So you don't have that common grammar. So, and to your point, how to bridge the gap between awareness and impact, I would say, there's a massive issue there, which is when you look at media consumption, when you look at information, that information flow. 6 years ago, people over 50 years old and people under 30 years old, only 6 years ago, 60% of them were watching the same thing. 2 years ago, it's 7%. So you have like a generation gap in information, and you need education to try to make the two come together. You need education on some basic tools to understand the world for Gen Z, and you need education on, I would say, leaders or senior leaders on how to talk to them. Otherwise, there's absolutely no communication.
Interesting. So they don't like being told what to think. Akash, let's come back to you. How do you find, what do you find when the needs of the organization, like getting people to come back to the office, for example, clash with the desires of younger staff? They don't think they need to come back. Or when younger staff want the organization, for example, to be something that it wasn't built to be, like a champion for social justice.
Yeah, look, I think the common trope of our times is we need to disintermediate the kind of power structures that we live in, right? Whether it's management or financial institutions or even forms of government. And I actually think the answer is a bit more complex for this next generation. They not only have to disintermediate some of those structures that no longer make sense and more directly engage, more directly produce, more directly create and influence, but also very importantly, they do have a role and responsibility in leading those intermediation points, including taking roles inside these large organizations that help define how we're going to change the culture of our work, for example.
So how do you do that at BNY Mellon?
So we have a program called Gen Edge, which has over 3,000 colleagues in it, about 10% of our staff. And one of the things we do is we have a reverse mentee-mentor program. So I have a mentee who is much earlier tenure than me. And they actually have a executive committee of their own, which actually influences policy, really gives us a formal view into how others are thinking about stuff. I think all of that is great, but it's still only the beginning. I think the real start of this really starts when our colleagues, in this case, really decide the answer cannot just be, I don't want to go to work in the way that people before did. It's that I want to do something very different in how we communicate, how our organization functions, how we choose to share information and make decisions. And that's the much harder thing, and I don't think we're really there yet to have that conversation.
Interesting. Farah, let's bring you back in here because I'd love you to put this into a context where you are in Egypt and see if are some of the things that you're hearing resonating with you. You're a young leader, you're a young entrepreneur, and you are also a woman. I'd love you to give us shine a light on what that is like and how this conversation around leadership and class of generations also has a gender lens.
So I think that's a really important aspect to look at. So a lot of the issues and the clash of the generations and priorities, they come from maybe not agreeing or not seeing things with the same lens, having different expectations, or just belonging to different set of values and purpose. So I think in a positive way, what I've seen with the younger generations and how they impact the organization as a whole is that they bring a sense of vulnerability also to the workplace. So they do openly talk about issues like racism, sexism, etc., and mental health, importantly as well. So all of these taboo subjects that were really boxed in and hidden earlier now can come to light and can actually start being discussed, and solutions that can come out of it. So from my experience, when I have a team member, a male team member, especially as a female in agriculture, there does come a lot of challenges. So I do see the benefits of having the younger generations, and
Interesting.
yes, they do come with a lot more open-minded. They do have a more open mind and more acceptance, I guess, for things that are not the norm.
Interesting. Will, so let's come back to you. You know, you still are a young leader. Do you consider yourself a young leader?
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
By definition. Yeah.
And I've listened to a couple of podcasts that you've been in. One of the things that you've said is that you hire people to make decisions. So even as you're bringing in younger folks into your organization, they're going to fit with your culture if they are able to make those fast decisions. You're trying to iterate, you're trying to innovate with your products. Have you found that that decisiveness relates at all to a generational thing, a question, or what does it relate to? What creates somebody who can make good decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've tried to build a culture at Whoop that creates an overall framework for moving fast. Like, we view it's a differentiator in health, in research, in technology to move at what we've called an uncomfortable pace. Like, we really want to be pushing the envelope on the speed at which we can work. And as your organization grows, you want to have more and more people making decisions. Otherwise, you're going to slow your organization way down. To take an extreme example, if the CEO makes all the decisions, all of a sudden the CEO is a bottleneck for everything happening.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can push more and more decisions down into the organization, then all of a sudden you can move really fast. And I view that has much more to do with the individual than the age. And maybe as a product of building a company as a 22-year-old for the last 10 years, I've tried to build a culture that almost removes this notion of age, where it's really a meritocracy around the best ideas winning. And I think that this idea that, you know, the younger generation wants to be more activist and the older generation doesn't, or the younger generation doesn't want to come back to the office, but the older generation does. Like, I can point to all sorts of examples that flip that narrative on its head. And so I think there, in some ways, there's an overreaction to trying to, build an organization that curates to the youth, while it may actually be a better strategy to sort of remove this notion of age and put all the ideas on the table.
What's the range of ages at Whoop?
18 to 68.
And do they all, I know that you use the data from your device at work as well. Is everybody there, regardless of age, happy to wear the device?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's a certain selection bias in joining Whoop that
Right.
you believe in health monitoring. You want to push that industry forwards. We have a sleep bonus where if you get over 85% of your sleep on Whoop every month, you get an extra $100 on your paycheck.
I love that.
We've got a red recovery policy where if you get a red recovery on Whoop, which is a sign that your body's run down and maybe you're getting sick or you're at risk of getting sick, we ask you to stay home. So we're definitely using our data in an active and innovative way.
Interesting. Máximo, let's come back to you. I wonder, how do you think we train current leaders, more seasoned leaders, shall we say, to be more attuned to the approach that younger staff might be looking for? I believe you do some of this work, is that right?
Yeah. We work with a lot of capacity building in what, it's not capacity building, it's more philosophy, what to be a leader nowadays means. For example, I grew up in a region where literally I don't have many leaders that I look up to. That's honestly. I work a lot with politics, so I don't have. Many are corrupt. We have the same problem since I was born. So do I look up to them or not? And I see this in many youth movements. So the first thing we discover is that we like the leaders. I'm totally talking by myself, for myself, no? But in our movements, we like the leaders that don't want to be leaders. We don't like bosses. We like the people that show with their actions what they predict, and because of that, we start like saying, okay, this guy, he can do it. and he shows with the example. For us, that is so important to be honest, to be open, to be clear. What is to be a leader? Why we want to be a leader? For recognition, power, money. What is behind that? What is the backstage? So for me, it's not like a difficult equation. It's like we have all these problems. Why we have so much trouble to get together and make things done? It's the ego.
Yeah.
So for us, a leader is, as our friend was saying, it's more horizontal, give more chances.
Yeah.
It's not only me right now. That doesn't work anymore for us.
Yeah, interesting. Guillaume, we talk a lot about diversity and how important diversity is. I wonder if you think diversity of generations is important within Brut, within the work that you do, or is unity more valuable than these different points of view?
I mean, I'm always surprised that we are asking the question of diversity. Because in order to be relevant to society, your customers, your viewers, whoever, you need to be like them. You need to look like them. So I'm always amazed with the question of diversity. It shouldn't be a question. I mean, it's obvious that you need to be as society is in order to be relevant, and I think it's true for any type of corporation. And to rebound on what you just said, when it comes to leadership, and to your point, there's plenty of counterexample. But when it comes to leadership, I think we are at a moment where through the academic education, a lot of leaders have learned to lead, and they've learned to be right. Okay, their goal was to be right. I'm right in my decision. Where right now we need to come up with a framework where, first of all, I'm not sure I'm right. Second of all, the world is very polarized, and how do we move forward when we disagree? How do we find a framework to move? And it's one of the biggest issues we have right now. Is there's no framework from that. There's either I'm going this way or I'm going this way, but there's no we disagree, but we know it's urgent that we need to act.
So how do you do that at Brut? When you disagree, how do you resolve it?
It's a good question. We have an advantage at Brut, which is we work on social media. Social media can be great or bad. It really depends on the way you use it. But we have an incentive to try. Because worst case scenario, if it fails, nobody is going to watch it.
Right.
Okay. So when we disagree, we tend to try. And we try both ways. Sometimes it happens that we're going to produce a story where it's not exactly the same thing. We're not opinionated, but there's something we need to embrace quickly, which is nuance and complexity. Those are very far from traditional media and legacy media as it is now. But when you have a news team of 25 years old and some people over 40 to help them tell the story more efficiently, all of a sudden we've disrupted the news cycle. Right. We came up with a much more positive one. We came up with stories that resonate across the globe, thanks to values that you were mentioning, not only in a specific country, but really across the globe. So it's really interesting to try.
Interesting. Farah, talk about that within the context of your multi-generational family business. What happens when there's conflict between the generations?
So a way that we structured that to avoid it from the beginning is that we're two completely different entities.
Okay.
So, however, our dad, of course, is still an amazing role model, and he is the industry expert. So even if we don't agree on something, we have to, Omar and I have to just put it in perspective that when it comes to agriculture, he does know more than us.
Right.
But when it comes to tech, data, operations, all the other stuff, we do go with what we think is right. But of course, the respect needs to be given to the areas that older generations will have more expertise in this case.
Interesting. Well, you've actually trained yourself to invite conflict, to invite people to disagree with you. Is that right? How have you done that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to creating a culture of an idea meritocracy, whereas as these guys spoke about earlier, you can put ideas on the table and really bat them around. And the one thing I want to go back to for a second is this idea of diversity of age. And I think it's an advantage that smaller companies have over larger ones in that you can have, like at Whoop, for example, we have C-level executives who are in their 30s and who are in their 60s. Now, if you look at a big Fortune 500 company, you might not see a C-level executive who's younger than 50 years old. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, and that may be good for an organization or it may not. But once you start to disassociate experience and age and performance, interesting things can happen. And it comes back to your question of dissent and how you make decisions and where the best decisions come from. If you can try to have those decisions feel like they can come from anywhere, and it doesn't matter if you're an intern or the CEO, you can come up with the next great chapter for an organization. I think that's an inspiring feeling.
Interesting. Akash, we're nearing the end of time, and I want to let you reflect on what you've heard. And I wonder, this question of building skills and training, I'm quite interested in that, in both how you're training the younger leaders, but also how you're making sure that those more seasoned folks who've been through these kind of interest rate rises before, who've been through recessions before, can also help bring the next generation along.
Well, I think just one reflection on this conversation is this is a generation of builders, and these are leaders who build organizations, who build a new future, and building in its essence is about confidence and about optimism. And I think one of the skills that we have to impart is a culture of optimism. And I think the other thing that you really hear from this group is about equity and ownership. And we often think about that as just financial ownership, but it's a much broader sense of me having an active voice, but participation in the longer run for what we're building. And I think if we are able to do these things at greater scale and to impart the lessons from all over the world that are here, I feel very fortunate, even for the large organizations who are out there, who may be changing, but maybe not as visibly yet.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like you to give my panel a huge round of applause. Thank them very much. Thank you guys very much. You've taken us right inside the challenges of a multi-generational workforce, and we know that change is stressful, and training helps, as we've discussed, and so does educating for the future, which brings us to our next conversation after a short break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with the president of the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, Tony Chan, but first this.